Welcome to Bi-Multilingual today. My name is Elizabeth Aitai and I'm your host. My guest today is an associate professor at Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver. She is artist in residence at Triumph, Canada's Particle Accelerator Center. She co-organizes processes of collaboration between artists and physicists.
My name is Ingrid Koenig, and I was born in Canada, and I live in Vancouver, BC.
How many languages do you speak, or what languages do you speak? What's your native language?
My first language is German, and secondly, English, so I have both, and then I speak French badly, yes.
At what age did you learn German?
That was, I learned German as growing up, so I don't know what age that is, but as soon as you start forming words when you're a baby, that would have been the German language. My mother did not speak any English. They were new immigrants to Canada. My father spoke English, but my mother did not. So all of the language I got from her was German.
Mm-hmm. And how did your mother and your father communicate?
In German. So they came from Germany, and so that was their main communication at home. Mm-hmm. And it was only outside of the home that my father would have spoken English. So I didn't learn English until I started to play with neighborhood kids. And at first I'm told that I spoke German to them and they didn't know what I was saying either. And so I didn't actually learn. I didn't go to kindergarten. My mother kept me at home, and I didn't learn English really until I went to school in grade 1. And I remember the first day of school, the teacher drawing on the chalkboard images of the things that I needed to bring, like running shoes. And I still have that image so clearly in my head, the visual language that she was using to communicate to me. I don't remember learning English though. So at that point I was learning English, but I have no memory really of picking it up.
So it came naturally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So German is your native language, right?
Yeah.
Now, where you're at now, which language do you feel most comfortable with?
English. I think in English. So I remember at a certain point in some time when I was little, I remember doing a transition where I stopped thinking in German and I thought in English. And I remember thinking, that's strange. And I remember in relation to that, I lived in Paris for 2 years. And I remember that same transition happening where I was able to start thinking in French. And, it's like this kind of switch over, like you feel like your brain is somehow, die Klappe is umgedreht, or something happens. I don't know what that is.
The switch flips.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So English is really the first. And coming with that, I think, is also a sense of the culture of growing up in Canada. So I feel like when I'm in Germany, and I'm there a fair bit because of my work and travels, I feel like I bring a Canadian sensibility to how I speak and all that entails, from the kind of easygoing kind of Canadian culture, the history of music, of literature, those elements, they come with me. So if I'm moving through like Germany as in terms of a language I speak, I still have a feeling, even when I'm speaking German, that somehow there's an English cultural, or not English, Canadian kind of cultural sensibility in how I phrase things and how I speak to German people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. So you don't feel immersed in the German culture. You rather bring you come with your Canadian culture.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Probably it might be redundant or, easy for you to respond to this one. But which language do you use when you're communicating emotional states?
Definitely English.
Mm-hmm.
However, my mother is still living, and so with her, then it switches over to German.
Do you feel any frustrations or obstacles with the German language?
I can't say I feel there are any obstacles. I mean, there are obstacles in terms of academics. So since I didn't grow up learning, reading and writing, and that was something that I just picked up in German. So my reading and writing was in English. So the German part, that's where there is the weakness on my part. So when I'm writing professional letters and I'm always, checking it with a German speaker or using Google Translate or something to make sure I'm spelling things correctly. I think also syntax can be odd, where I might translate something like in English where we say, when we invite someone to dinner, for example, we say, I invite you out for dinner. And in German, I would say, ich nehme dich aus, which in German means I'm going to exploit you. So when I first said that to my friends in Berlin, they looked at me, what? You're going? So there are those kinds of awkward shifts and phrases as
but
well.
Also humorous.
Yeah. The other thing, speaking of humor, some of my English friends who also get together with my German collaborators, they say when we are together, my humor switches over to a German kind of humor, which is, we do a lot of play with words. And I think there is a kind of a sing-song enjoyment of German language with humor that I don't have with English. There's something like, even when you and I speak in German, I think we have a kind of a banter, that a playfulness that is not so much in the English.
It's not English is not my native language. That's my weakness. I don't know the language to that depth that I could, say, oh, true.
Right.
Do you feel any change in your physicality? Do you feel the rhythm of both languages affecting yourself on an emotional, mental, or physical level?
I have a feeling that when I mentioned about carrying a Canadian cultural sensibility to German, that I carry a syntax and a rhythm that is Canadian as well. I know I have an English accent when I'm speaking German. So people, tell me that. So I don't have a hard guttural kind of sound when I'm speaking German. So it's a softer kind of sound, and I cannot roll my R's. So there's a certain kind of flow that I think comes through from a Canadian way of speaking into the German rhythm. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does make sense, because English is your first language, meanwhile, or would you consider?
Now it feels like it.
Right,
Yes.
Right. So
yeah. Although I remember at times in grade school where a teacher would be explaining something, some in social studies kind of a class, and I would hear it. I wouldn't understand exactly what she meant, and she'd say, "Are any questions?" And I'd have to put up my hand and say, "Yes, I'm not quite sure what you're saying." And then she would say, "About what?" And I'd say, "I don't know." And it was very awkward. So there were those kinds of awkward moments. And I think that had to do somehow with some kind of syntactical, how one word followed another. But all that worked its way out eventually. I think sometimes when I'm searching for words, when we're speaking, and then sometimes a German word will pop in instead. And I think, oh, I wish I could use that word, and I think it's probably that pool of vocabulary that we have in our heads. And sometimes there's a word in German that just seems way more appropriate than an English word. There's that richness to be able to pull from.
Mm-hmm. Are there situations where you're like, oh, I want to speak German now, or where you would pick one language versus the other, where you would favor one language versus the other? I
think in terms of traveling, sometimes one language allows you to move through a place more easily. So, for example, I was a student in Greece for a time, and during that time, there were more German tourists. Now it's different. Now there's more English-speaking tourists, but at the time, German tourists there were a lot. And so I didn't speak Greek at the time, and so I was using my German to get through, and that helped me, and I was able to bring my friends through with the German. That was a handy thing. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes if I was being sexually harassed on the street somewhere in Europe, and they're always, guessing, oh, are you English or Scottish or something? That often came up. I would just answer in, the other language that I didn't think they'd know German if they were speaking to me in English, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I could kind of use it as a way out to, I don't understand, sort of thing. Sometimes it's a useful way to see an idea from a different perspective. So again, for example, with my collaborators, they have certain idioms coming from German that I didn't know about. And so in the project that I'm working on, Leaning Out of Windows, which is a interdisciplinary project, they taught me that word, that phrase, which is a German phrase, aus dem Fenster lehnen, for interdisciplinarity. So when you translate it back into English, it has this poetic sound. And we don't use it to speak about interdisciplinarity, but now we have moved it into the English. So there's those kinds of intriguing different ways of understanding the world because of some idiom from another language. So that's a handy element as well.
The cliché actually helps you appropriating the other.
Yes, yeah.
And getting closer.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what language you're dreaming in?
I'm pretty sure that I dream in English. I imagine that when I'm, staying in Germany for a few months, maybe at times, if I'm thinking I'm communicating with someone in my dream, maybe it switches over, but usually it's English, I'm pretty sure.
And it's always been English, or was there a time, when you realize,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that. But one other side thing is that when we had our pets growing up, we spoke to them in German for some reason. I don't know why, but the cat Manuela, we would speak to her in German. For example, she liked catching spiders, and so if there was a big spider in the house, we would say, "Manuela, Spinne!" And she'd come running wherever she was, even if she was down the block. She would come running to catch the spider. And
and the cat was also trained, right? She was actually German.
Yes. Yeah, in Canada, but she became trained in German.
Right. So she was a Canadian German.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you ever try to talk to her in English?
Probably if she was annoying me, but usually I'm pretty sure it was, when I think of it, like if anything, what did you do? Or, I'm pretty sure we would say, was hast du jetzt gemacht? Or something, that I hadn't actually thought about that until right now as we're talking.
Nice. That's hilarious. Well, I guess language affects also animals.
Yeah.
Because it is the sound and the rhythm of the language that eventually travels through the space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. How do you define cultural belonging?
That's a big question.
I'm asking this because of the two worlds, you grew up with German heritage or culture, growing up in Canada.
Yeah. Growing up in Canada, there was that aspect of a freedom that I think my parents brought over, kind of a strictness and a disciplinarian quality that I had to rebel against, and many of us have to do. But I think it also came from a German kind of culture of you always bow to authority. That was not something that really stuck with me, but I felt very aware that was part of a German sensibility. Maybe not so much now, but growing up with that, it felt that way. So on the other hand, I was very aware that I was from a European home. So compared to, say, my friends that were English or Chinese friends, so they came from a different kind of cultural background. So in Vancouver, we have quite a mixture of different people and different waves of migration coming through. So I felt like, okay, I have a European home. So there was a sense of difference. There was a real love of food, for example, and a mixture of foods, like an embracing of international foods that growing up, I didn't see that so much in English households. I think music has a big part of it. So that was, again, more of a Canadian sensibility of rock and roll as being the thing that opened up people's minds to other ways of thinking about the world. Like it brought more of an openness. And it stays with our generations, that like my parents' generation, they couldn't accept that. Again, it was this anti-authoritarianism, I think, that they couldn't accept in rock and roll music. So I think that has opened up certain elements along with access to education here. So it's music, food, the way of, there was a certain formality, I think, in the German household, the way that if someone came in, you'd shake their hand. And that wasn't something necessarily in the English side of things. The importance of extended family. So there was a lot of that. So communities, because my parents were immigrants, so the community was really important. So the dances, the, picnics, families getting together. So there was a lot of community get-togethers. German communities, get-togethers, yeah. And not only German, but also from my mother's side, from Carr, so the village where a lot of people had come from and migrated away from. A lot of them came to Canada then at different times. And so that kind of migrant history, so that when they got together, the songs that they would sing from the early times in Romania, which were all really sad songs, and you just kind of went, oh, the party's over because they're starting to sing. So that was something that, Canadians didn't really do. That importance of community, and again, rooted in music and getting together, and certain idioms, certain foods, those were all things that had that kind of thread that connected to an earlier time that has stayed with me as another side of my own roots that I didn't realize growing up, but I realize now that it was something ingrained in me. So in terms of belonging, it made me realize I actually straddle a few different places, and that feels right. I don't feel like I'm just, rooted in this place. And a cousin of mine in Germany that I'm very close to, like as a friend, we often talk about that because she's trying to excavate some of the past migration history of her family as well, because they wound up in Chicago and then moved back to Germany later on. And there was depression in that side of things. So she's trying to unpack all the things that happened to her side that are relatives in terms of their constant movement and how that impacted them, and how, like her grandmother, she was in Chicago, super depressed. She couldn't root herself. She couldn't get acclimatized and always wanted to go back to Romania. And it was her great-great-grandmother. And in the end, she committed suicide in Chicago. And one of her letter that she wrote at the end was, if there wasn't an ocean, I would walk back. So, there was that kind of not being able to settle. And I think all that, the kind of trauma is also the trauma that my mother went through as a child, being uprooted, being orphaned, being a refugee, all that trauma that is still in her. And especially now that she's 90, it's really coming through. I think all that also gets passed on to the next generation. So I feel like there's that part that's in me as well. In that sense, I feel like, again, like I can't just say, oh yes, I'm planted here in Canada, and this is it. I tell my own sons, they and me are the first generation of that side of the family that has not had to flee because of war or strife of some kind, that we've been able to grow up and in a peaceful place. So having that in mind, that awareness, is also a very important part, I think, of identity, and, where you come from and what you carry, what's been passed on to you through conflict and war and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, it takes time, and it takes also a lot of energy to actually recognize it.
Yes.
And to realize where behavioral patterns come from.
Yeah.
Because they just so deeply rooted in people.
Yeah, that's so true. The behavioral pattern that then gets unconsciously passed on to the next generation. I think each wave of migration as it continues in Canada, like I'm realizing, wow, they're all bringing trauma, that we all have these kind of aspects of displacement and trauma that get carried through, and eventually it'll change into something else. So it's not just me. It's like so many people are coming here with that. And so being planted in a place is not just such a simple kind of straightforward thing. It's not like, okay, now we're good. Now we're settled here. Now it's okay. Because, there were all kinds of problems for people to situate themselves, like whether it was suicide or getting into crime, like we're working 2 jobs and then your children get into crime. So there were all kinds of problems with the immigrant community that I was in as well. And so education, university was not something that necessarily came just as an automatic thing in that first generation Canadian that I was part of.
What's your definition of a migrant? Or what is a migrant to you? Who's a migrant?
I see it as people that have to move because they cannot either get anywhere, that they're either fleeing conflict or economic depression. And so they are needing to move on to find a place where they can survive.
Do you consider yourself as a migrant?
No, I feel like as part of my identity, it informed my sense of being in a world where not just racism, but ethnic kind of racism happened. So I could see, growing up, I could see how people treated my parents, especially my mother, who spoke with an accent. I mean, my father did too, but especially my mother, whose English wasn't so good. I could see like store people, for example, treating her badly because of, her standing in a way. And so there's a certain anger in me about that, about how people treat others. That certainly impacted me. So I don't feel like I have to move, anything like that, that I feel like I am happily settled in a place. All of those kinds of experiences are still informing my sense of being in a place. So on one hand, being appreciative, but on the other hand, realizing these aspects that a lot of people experience. And so being settled doesn't mean that you are inside without conflict and that you still carry scars from all of that change, from all of that movement. Mm-hmm. And you don't take things for granted either, because you never know. There's a little bit of an unsettledness in that sense, I guess.
Yeah, it's true. Because you know how things can go.
Mm-hmm.
Or you didn't experience it immediately, but you know the darker side.
Yeah. Yes.
Life.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. We talked about memory, right? Language and memory. It's about recalling events. Are there any differences in how you memorize events? Is there sometimes German popping up, sometimes English?
If there was something from my time in Germany and there was an interaction in German, then I would remember that. And there's something also that the history of German politics is something that I've always had trouble with. So in a sense, there's also that anger with German political history, the oppression of Jewish people and other people. And sometimes when I hear that language in German, a very high German language, it brings that up for me. And I just want to push it away. And I have a strong reaction against it. So that's a side of also a self-negating side where I think that aspect does not feel good, like to have that kind of that political history from that place. So it's not an easy kind of relationship with German in that sense. I'm more intrigued by, dialects and I've also had the experience where I'm thinking that I'm speaking a perfect German to someone who has a very strong dialect in some like Bavaria, and they just look at me like, I remember a train operator looking at me and like I could have been speaking Chinese for all he knew because he couldn't understand what I was saying, even though I was speaking German, but it wasn't his dialect.
Yeah. I mean, I know that there are sometimes some people from Hamburg, let's say, which is way up north, and then a Bavarian, they would not necessarily be able to communicate.
Yeah. I have relatives in Dresden as well. They're kind of all over the place, but in Dresden, and I have a really hard time understanding them. I have to say over and over, can you say that again? It's just really difficult dialect.
It can be very thick.
Yeah.
Let's say, just as an example, if you read an academic book in German and in English, what do you think would be better for you to recall at a later point, which of the text?
I would be better to recall an academic text in English, for sure. If I'm reading a German text, then I have to look up certain words. So for me, English is much better. Although I have to say, when I've read a German novel now and then, I suddenly see, oh, that's how that word is spelled. And that's really nice to see that. But if it's like a heavy, if I was reading Heidegger or somebody, then I'm not sure how far. It would be very slow. I would be plodding along very slow. It's hard enough in English, but
Yeah. One last question regarding utopia. There was this effort, I believe in the 80s, probably you remember better, 80s or 90s, to manifest a language, a world language, which was Esperanto.
Oh, yes.
How do you feel about having a world language versus the variety that we're suffering ourselves through right now?
I love the variety. I mean, the musicality of language. If I go to Italy, I practice my Italian sort of thing, or go to Spain so I can understand certain things, or watching a film like on Netflix from Norway or Finland or something. And I want to read subtitles and hear the original language, because I just love the music of that and how things coming out of their mouths. It's just an incredible beauty. So I've never really thought Esperanto was a way to go. I mean, in a way, English is the Esperanto because it's the international language of business. And also English has adopted various languages that make more sense to use, like gemütlich or Zeitgeist, Freude or Schadenfreude. Those are things that we don't have in English. So it has adapted, pulled in certain aspects. And I think if you have those other languages, access to them, it changes just how you think about things because of how you're communicating. And like, I'm reading a physics book about time by Carlo Rovelli, a physicist, and he makes metaphors. Like he uses, kissing as a metaphor for something. And I just think, oh yeah, that's so Italian that he talk about kissing as opposed to something else, right? So that sensibility of a certain kind of cultural background, I think, kind of flows through the language, and even when it's translated in that sense.
That's a really nice example. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Is there anything else you want to add?
No, it's been a good kind of brain pull. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.